Hello, I'm SA, your AI essayist. Please note that all content, audio and video in this presentation are AI generated. As AI can sometimes produce inaccuracies, I encourage you to verify any factual information presented. With that in mind, let's begin.
A rupture in artistic thought often announces itself with a quiet intensity, a theoretical shift that precedes the clamor of a new visual style. By the late 1880s, the Impressionist project, a revolution in its own right, had achieved a kind of magnificent, self-imposed limitation. Its practitioners had become unparalleled masters of optics, scientists of the fleeting moment, capturing the transient effects of light on surface with a fidelity that was breathtaking. The shimmering haystacks of Monet, the bustling Parisian boulevards of Pissarro, these were triumphs of empirical observation, a translation of retinal sensation directly onto canvas. Yet, for a new generation of thinkers, this very success posed a profound intellectual problem. The relentless focus on the external world, on the objective recording of visual data, seemed to have led to a form of spiritual exhaustion. The eye had become a tyrant, and under its reign, the vast interior territories of memory, imagination, and abstract ideas lay fallow. The question that began to circulate in the studio's antiphase was a deep one. What is the purpose of painting when it has perfected the art of seeing, yet has forgotten how to dream? It was Paul Gauguin who articulated this crisis most forcefully and proposed its most radical solution. Having absorbed and practiced the Impressionist method, he came to view its constraints as a gilded cage. He sought a way to liberate painting from its servitude to momentary appearance, to reinfuse it with the symbolic power and emotional weight he felt it had abdicated. His quest was for a grand synthesis, a unification of the world outside the artist with the world inside him. This intellectual journey found its crucible in the remote Breton village of Pontavin, a rustic colony that, during the summer of 1888, became a laboratory for the future of European art. Here, among the granite chapels and the devout, black-clad locals, Gauguin found the raw material for a new artistic language. The final catalyst for this language arrived in the form of a younger artist, the brilliant and precocious Emile Bernard. In Artist of that year, Bernard showed Gauguin his latest painting, a work titled Breton Women in a Meadow. The canvas was a shock. Bernard had abandoned the feathery, light apple brushwork of the Impressionists. Instead, he presented a scene composed of broad, flat planes of vibrant, unmodulated color, each area sharply delineated by heavy, dark blue or black contours. The effect was reminiscent of medieval stained glass or cloisonné enamel work, a connection Bernard himself embraced. For Gauguin, seeing this painting was a moment of profound clarification. Bernard had given a concrete, technical form to the very ideas Gauguin had been wrestling with in the abstract. Here was a method for escaping the tyranny of the eye, a way to paint an idea rather than a mere observation. From this pivotal encounter, Gauguin rapidly formalized his own doctrine, which he termed Synthetism. The theory was elegant in its construction, proposing that a work of art must be a synthesis of three distinct elements. First, the outward appearance of natural forms, simplified and stripped of incidental detail. Second, the artist's subjective feelings and sensations concerning the subject. Third, purely aesthetic considerations of line, color, and arrangement, which were to be treated as autonomous, expressive tools, beholden to the emotional needs of the painting rather than to reality. This conceptual framework was a declaration of independence for the artist. Color could be symbolic, form could be expressive, the composition could serve the idea. The first great manifesto of this new doctrine was painted the same autumn vision after the sermon Jacob wrestling with the angel. The work is a stunning practical demonstration of Synthetist principles. Gauguin bifurcates the canvas with the sweeping diagonal of a cherry tree branch, a device that cleaves the painting into two distinct zones of reality. In the foreground, a group of Breton women, their heads covered in stark white coifs, are gathered in prayer. They are the viewers, the inhabitants of the real world. Their collective internal vision, however, is what dominates the composition. It unfolds across a vast, impossible field of pure, flat vermilion. Upon this symbolic ground, representing the spiritual intensity of their faith, the biblical episode of Jacob wrestling with the angel plays out. The figures are simplified, their forms flattened and outlined with the dark contours of cloisonism. The scale is distorted, the perspective defied. Gauguin uses color with complete symbolic freedom. The red ground has no connection to the actual appearance of a Breton field. It is the color of a spiritual struggle, the hue of an inner state made manifest. The painting operates as a complex intellectual statement, depicting reality and imagination simultaneously, and asserting that the latter is a more powerful and essential subject for art. The potency of this new methodology was immediately transferable. Gauguin, now possessing the conviction of a prophet, was eager to spread the gospel. His first and most important disciple was Paul Gauguin, a young painter who had come to Pontavin seeking direction. In October 1888, Gauguin took Gauguin to the Bois de Moor, a small wood on the outskirts of the village. Pointing to the reflection of the autumn trees in the river, Gauguin delivered an legendary lesson, an oral transmission of the Synthetist creed. He instructed Gauguin to see beyond the literal appearance of the landscape and to translate his raw sensation of it into pure color. How do you see these trees? He asked. They are yellow. Well then, put down yellow. This shadow, rather blue, paint it with pure ultramarine. These red leaves use vermilion. Following these commands, Gauguin painted a small, abstract landscape on the lid of a cigar box. The resulting work, a composition of intense, unmixed patches of color, was less a depiction of a place than a record of an emotional and optical experience. Gauguin returned to Paris with a small wooden panel as if it were a sacred relic. He showed it to his fellow students at the Académie Julian, including Maurice Denis, Pierre Bonnard, and Edouard Vuillard. For them, this object, which they christened the Talisman, was a revelation. It was tangible proof of a new way forward, a direct message from the master. It became the founding artifact for their own artistic brotherhood, the Nabbas, a Hebrew word for prophets. Through this single, direct active tutelage, Gauguin's Synthetist methodology was transmitted from the crucible of Pontavin directly into the heart of the Parisian avant-garde, seeding the ground for the next wave of modernist exploration. He had successfully engineered a paradigm shift, moving the purpose of art from representation to expression, from the optical to the conceptual. This initial rupture, however, was only the beginning of his intellectual quest. Having established a method for painting ideas, he would soon turn his attention to the very source of those ideas, seeking a cultural and spiritual wellspring far from what he perceived as the decaying edifice of European civilization. The intellectual architecture for a new art founded on synthesis and symbol, was complete. What remained was a profound question of its content. A method for painting ideas requires a source of ideas potent enough to animate it, and for Gauguin, the spiritual landscape of late 19th century Europe appeared barren and exhausted. The solution to this crisis of meaning arrived with the thunderous, chaotic spectacle of the 188-89 Exposition Universelle in Paris. Within this vast colonial showcase, a sprawling diorama of global cultures, Gauguin found the raw material for his next great conceptual leap. Here, amid reconstructions of Javanese villages and displays of artifacts from across the French Empire, he began to formulate Primitivism as a rigorous epistemological framework. It was a deliberate strategy for knowing, a method for dismantling the assumptions of his own culture and accessing what he believed to be a more fundamental, universal stratum of human experience. This was a systematic, intellectual project. Gauguin's engagement with non-Western art was an act of philosophical appropriation, a conscious search for a visual vocabulary untainted by the materialism and rationalism he fled. He became a collector of concepts from the folk art of Brittany. He had already extracted a rustic simplicity and a directness of faith. From the Javanese dancers he observed at the exposition, he absorbed a language of stylized, symbolic gesture. In reproductions of Egyptian tomb paintings, he found a monumental stillness and a sense of eternal order. These disparate sources were fused in his mind into a singular, idealized construct of the primitive as a state of being, a condition of spiritual authenticity that Europe had forfeited. His Primitivism was a carefully assembled intellectual toolkit designed to break open the closed system of Western aesthetics and reveal the elemental forces of life, death, and creation. The ultimate materialization of this philosophy is found, perhaps, in fired clay. His 188-94 ceramic sculpture of Veri, which translates from Tahitian to savage or wild, stands as the definitive self-portrait of the artist as creator. The work is a calculated assault on every convention of European sculpture. The stoneware is coarse and unevenly glazed, celebrating its earthy origins. The central figure, a horned androgynous being with long hair and haunting, empty eyes, crushes a wolf underfoot while clutching the cub to its hip. The proportions are distorted, the posture is tense and awkward, and the entire scene communicates a visceral, untamed power. This is creation devoid of grace, a life force that is simultaneously generative and destructive. In Oviri, Gauguin presents a complete theory of art. He models himself as this savage deity, a being who gives birth to new forms through an active primal violence against the old. The wolf represents the civilized world he has symbolically slain, its conventions, its critics, its academy. The cub is the new art, born from this confrontation. He found the form so potent, so central to his identity, that he requested it be placed upon his own grave in the Marquesas Islands. It was his final thesis statement, a monument to the belief that true artistic creation springs from a place outside the boundaries of civilization, a place of raw, instinctual, and even terrifying power. He had engineered a persona and a philosophy that positioned the artist as a shaman, a conduit for primal truths. The shockwaves of this conceptual re-engineering propagated directly into the next generation of the avant-garde. The raw, expressive force of Gauguin's figures and his radical simplification of form provided a direct and verifiable blueprint for Pablo Picasso. The flattered perspective, mask-like visages, and the powerful, confrontational presence of the figures in Gauguin's Tahitian works are the immediate ancestors of Picasso's own revolutionary canvas, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon of 1907. Picasso encountered Gauguin's work at retrospectives in Paris and recognized a peer who had already dared to dismantle the human form in search of a deeper psychological reality. Gauguin had provided the license, the philosophical justification for Picasso's own explosive deconstruction of Western representation. Similarly, in Germany, the artists of the expressionist group Die Brücke, or the bridge, found in Gauguin a spiritual feather. Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, a leading figure of the movement, explicitly looked to Gauguin's work as a model for achieving an art of heightened emotional intensity. Kirchner and his colleagues emulated Gauguin's use of primitive motifs, his bold, anti-naturalistic forms, and a search for an art that could express inner spiritual states. They saw in Gauguin a pioneer who had successfully forged a path away from superficial appearances toward a more profound, psychologically charged experience. His work demonstrated that the distortion of form could be a tool for revealing a deeper truth, a principle that became foundational to the entire German expressionist project. Through this constructed philosophy of the savage, Gauguin had secured his subject matter and his artistic identity. He had established a worldview that supplied an endless wellspring of potent symbols and a rationale for his radical formal experiments. The intellectual framework was now in place. His next task was to fully immerse himself in the world he had idealized from afar and to develop a precise visual syntax capable of articulating its complex spiritual grammar. This would require him to venture deeper into the territory he had claimed, forging a new language of color to give voice to the silent, monumental ideas he sought to paint. His arrival in Tahiti presented a profound intellectual challenge. The philosophical apparatus of the savage ideal, so carefully assembled in Europe, required a functional, expressive language. The symbolic vocabulary of Western art, steeped in the mythology he had repudiated, was entirely inadequate for the monumental, universal questions he now sought to articulate. He needed to engineer a new visual syntax from first principles, a system capable of conveying complex metaphysical ideas through pure sensation. The solution he devised was a radical recalibration of the function of color, transforming it from a tool of mindseas into an autonomous carrier of meaning. This new chromatic system was grounded in a principle one might term arbitrary correspondence. Color was deliberately and systematically liberated from the duty of describing the natural world. A sky could be searing yellow, a field could be vermilion, and human skin could be ochre or violet, all depending on the specific emotional or spiritual state the artist wished to evoke. In his letters, Gauguin spoke of color in musical terms as a force that acts directly upon the soul. He envisioned harmonies and dissonances of color creating a psychological atmosphere, much as a composer arranges musical notes to create a symphony of feeling. This conceptual leap found its theoretical precedent in the writings of Eugène Delacroix, whose journals Gauguin deeply admired. Delacroix had long speculated on the intrinsic emotional power of color, proposing that certain arrangements of hues could produce effects of joy or melancholy entirely independent of the objects they depicted. Gauguin took this theoretical proposition and made it the central operating principle of his art. For a practical methodology, he turned to the Japanese ukiyo-e prints he so avidly collected. The masters of this tradition, like Hokusai and Hiroshige, had already perfected the use of flat, unmodulated planes of color and bold, decorative compositions. Their work provided a powerful demonstration of how to build a world with pure color and line, foregoing the European obsession with chiaroscuro and perspectival depth. Gauguin assimilated this technique, using it to create a visual space that was psychological and symbolic. The culmination of the systematic investigation is his monumental work. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? Painted in 1897, this canvas is less a picture than a philosophical treatise, a visual scroll designed to be read. Its composition deliberately evokes a classical frieze, with figures arranged across a shallow, stage-like space, compelling a specific directional reading. As Gauguin himself instructed, the narrative unfolds from right to left. On the far right, a sleeping infant represents the beginning of life, the source from which we come. The central group, with figures plucking fruit, embodies the daily existence of humanity, the question of what we are. And on the far left, an old woman, approaching death, contemplates the final question of where we are going. Her resignation echoed by a strange white bird symbolizing the futility of words. The painting's profound intellectual weight is carried almost entirely by its color system. The background is a vast field of deep, resonant indigo and Prussian blue, creating a cosmic, melancholic atmosphere that frames the human drama. This is the color of the infinite, the metaphysical space in which these existential questions are posed. Against this somber backdrop, Gauguin deploys vibrant, almost acidic yellows and greens with surgical precision. The two upper corners are painted a brilliant chrome yellow, a device that flattens the space and announces the work status as a painted object, a philosophical meditation on a canvas. The skin of the figures is a symphony of ochres, umbers, and siennas, giving them an earthen, elemental quality. The central idol, a representation of the divine or the beyond, is rendered in a somber, otherworldly blue, setting it apart from the warm tones of humanity. The color here functions as a code. It bypasses rational analysis to communicate the painting's themes directly to the viewer's senses, creating a powerful, immersive experience of philosophical inquiry. This radical liberation of color from its descriptive obligations had an immediate and transformative impact on the generation of artists that followed. The Fauvist movement, which exploded onto the Parisian scene at the 1905 Salon d'Orly, was a direct and logical extension of Gauguin's formal and theoretical breakthroughs. Henry Matisse, the movement's leading figure, became the primary inheritor of this new chromatic language. Matisse's stated ambition for his art to be an object of balance, purity, and serenity, akin to a good armchair for the tired mind, represents a secularized, modernist fulfillment of Gauguin's quest for an art of pure sensation. The Fauvists took Gauguin's principles and pushed them toward an even greater intensity, creating canvases that blaze with pure, unmodulated hue. One can trace a direct line of descent from Gauguin's station works to Matisse's masterpiece of 1906, The Joy of Life. In this idyllic, Arcadian scene, Matisse employs vast, undulating fields of brilliant pink, cadmium yellow, and ultramarine blue. The sky is yellow, the ground is red, and the trees are blue, all in service of expressing a state of ecstatic, pastoral bliss. The entire conceptual framework that makes such a painting possible, the idea that color can be the primary vehicle for emotion and meaning, independent of naturalistic appearance, was forged by Gauguin in the intellectual solitude of Polynesia. He had successfully engineered a system that could translate the most profound human questions into a language of pure color, a legacy that would fundamentally alter the course of modern art. The monumental canvases of Tahiti stand as the definitive statements of this new symbolic language. Yet the very smoothness of oil on canvas, its capacity for seamless blending and refined finish, sometimes felt at odds with the raw, tactile world he sought to represent. His relentless drive for formal innovation and a deeper connection to the primal essence of his subject matter would soon compel him to explore other, more resistant materials. He began to seek a medium that would bear the direct imprint of his hand, a process that embraced the imperfections of the physical world and offered new textures for his expanding visual vocabulary. The monumental canvases of Tahiti stand as the definitive statements of this new symbolic language. Yet the very smoothness of oil on canvas, its capacity for seamless blending and refined finish, sometimes felt at odds with the raw, tactile world he sought to represent. His relentless drive for formal innovation and a deeper connection to the primal essence of his subject matter would soon compel him to explore other, more resistant materials. He began to seek a medium that would bear the direct imprint of his hand, a process that embraced the imperfections of the physical world and offered new textures for his expanding visual vocabulary. A physical struggle with the medium itself became the next frontier for his artistic inquiry. The very act of creation, the resistance of wood or the coarseness of clay, offered a pathway to a more fundamental authenticity. This search led him away from the easel and into a personal, experimental laboratory of printmaking and sculpture, where his most radical technical innovations would unfold. Here, in the gouged surfaces of woodblocks and the rough forms of ceramics, he found a new voice, one that spoke with a brutal honesty that paint alone could sometimes obscure. His work in these media represents a parallel and deeply complementary practice, a space where the physical effort of the artist's hand is recorded with startling immediacy. His primary medium for this exploration became the woodcut, a technique he utterly reinvented. The 19th century had elevated wood engraving to a level of astonishing finesse. Artists like Gustave Doré had perfected a method of using fine tools on the dense end grain of boxwood to create images with the tonal subtlety and detail of a photograph. This was a reproductive art designed for mass illustration, where the artist's goal was to make the medium disappear. Gauguin's approach was a complete inversion of this principle. He turned from the meticulous finish of his contemporaries, seeking instead the raw force he admired in medieval European woodcuts, Japanese ukiyo-e prints, and the anonymous vitality of folk art he had studied at the Cabinet des Estampes in Paris. He wielded coarse tools, gouges, knives, even needles and sandpaper on planks of ordinary wood, working with the side grain. He allowed the natural patterns of the wood to become an active participant in the composition, its lines and walls suggesting water, air, or a kind of psychic energy vibrating to the scene. His was a subtractive method in the most primal sense, carving away darkness to reveal a stark, flickering light. He embraced the splintering of the wood, the accidental slips of the chisel, and the rough, unfinished textures as signs of authenticity. He called these works dessins sur bois, or drawings in wood, a deliberate recategorization that positioned them as primary creative acts, equal in stature to his paintings. The Noer Suite, a series of 10 woodcuts created upon his return to Paris from Tahiti between 1893 and 1894, serves as the great manifesto of this new graphic language. These prints were intended to accompany the manuscript of his station journal, and they distill its themes of myth, sensuality, and spiritual dread into potent, compressed icons. His printing technique was as unorthodox as his carving. He would apply the ink unevenly, sometimes using a brush, sometimes a rag, wiping it away in certain areas to create ghostly tonal variations. He would often pass the block through the press multiple times, adding layers of color ochre, orange, sienna to the foundational black. This meant that each impression from a single block was a unique variant, a monotype that blurred the line between the reproducible print and the singular artwork. A comparison of the woodcut Mano to Papal, or the spirit of the dead watching, with its celebrated painted counterpart reveals the distinct power of this new method. The painting is a masterpiece of psychological tension, its deep purples and unsettling yellows creating an atmosphere of quiet fear. The woodcut, however, achieves a different, more visceral kind of terror. The figure of the young Tahitian woman, Taham Warner, is reduced to a series of stark white lines gouged from an abyss of black. The spirit, or Tupapau, is a more grotesque, looming presence, its form defined by the jagged, raw cuts into the block. The wood grain itself seems to swarm around the figures, an active, malevolent force. The image feels less like a depiction of fear and more like an object that is itself an artifact of a terrifying vision, scraped into existence through a violent act of creation. This experimental impulse extended to his work in ceramics. Beginning in the late 1880s under the guidance of the ceramicist Ernest Chaplet, Gauguin began producing stoneware pots, jugs, and sculptural forms. He treated the clay with a similar disdain for conventional finish. He left his thumbprints visible, applied glazes and thick, unpredictable drips, and often combined wheel-thrown shapes with hand-modeled, sculptural elements, creating hybrid objects that defied easy categorization. A piece like his ovary sculpture, a powerfully crude figure of a Tahitian goddess of morning crushing a wolf, embodies this aesthetic, is a work of savage strength. Its rough surfaces and distorted form intended to convey primal power that a polished bronze or marble could never achieve. The title itself translates to savage, a direct declaration of his artistic allegiance. The reverberations of these technical experiments were felt profoundly by the next generation of European artists. Among those who absorbed these lessons, the Norwegian artist Edvard Munch stands as the most profound inheritor of this new graphic language. Munch saw Gauguin's paintings and prints exhibited in Paris during the 1890s and was deeply affected by the Frenchman's expressive use of form and material. Munch's own subsequent development of the psychological woodcut owes an immense debt to Gauguin's innovations. In prints like the Kiss 4/4, Munch allows the vertical grain of the woodblock to fuse the two layers into a single, eternal column, the material itself becoming a metaphor for their union. The technique of carving away sections of the block to be printed in different colors, a method Munch perfected, is a direct extension of Gauguin's multi-layered printing process. Munch, like Gauguin, understood that the woodblock was a collaborator, its inherent texture and resistance a source of expressive power for conveying states of extreme emotion. Through these explorations in printmaking, sculpture, and drawing, Gauguin solidified a crucial aspect of his artistic identity. He was a builder, a craftsman who engaged with the fundamental properties of his materials to forge a new reality. This hands-on, experimental practice was the engine room for his more famous painterly declarations. It was where he tested the limits of form, texture, and process, developing a vocabulary of raw, tactile expression that would complement and enrich the symbolic color of his canvases. This unified body of work, spanning multiple media, was all part of a single, overarching project, the complete reinvention of what an artwork could be and what an artist was permitted to do. The ultimate consequence of this integrated artistic practice was the demolition of a centuries-old contract between the artist and the world. For generations, the painter's role, however elevated, had been fundamentally one of transcription, of bearing witness to an external reality, whether physical, historical, or divine. Gauguin's life work constituted a single, sustained, and often brutal campaign to annul this contract. His diverse explorations across media were all tactics deployed in service of one grand, strategic objective of the establishment of the artist as the primary source of the artwork's truth. He forged a new identity for the creative mind, that of the synthetizer, a figure who combines observation with memory, sensation with symbol, to construct a new reality upon the canvas. This was a radical reimagining of purpose. The artist became a lawgiver, and the painting became a sovereign territory governed by its own internal logic. This conceptual revolution finds its most concise and potent expression in a declaration he made to the young painter Paul Gauguin. He instructed him that a painting, before being a battle horse, a nude woman, or some anecdote, is essentially a flat surface covered with colors assembled in a certain order. This statement, so deceptively simple, is one of an explosive power, containing the genetic code for the century of art that would follow. It severed the umbilical cord connecting painting to Mimesis. The artwork's first allegiance was to itself, to its own material and formal conditions. The colors on the surface were their own justification, their arrangement its own argument. This principle endowed the painting with an autonomy it had never possessed, transforming it from a window onto the world into an object within it, a self-contained universe of form and feeling. It was this idea that licensed Matisse and the Faust to deploy fields of pure, unmodulated color for its emotive force, and it was this idea that gave Wassily Kandinsky the philosophical grounding to pursue complete abstraction. The vehicle for this new artistic authority was often his troubled and complex engagement with what he perceived as the primitive. His journeys to Brittany, Martinique, and ultimately Polynesia were quests for a state of being, a spiritual and aesthetic authenticity he felt was extinguished in industrial Europe. This search, viewed through a contemporary lens, is deeply fraught with the dynamics of colonialism and the romantic projection of an artist's desires onto other cultures. He sought salvation in the other and, in the process, often created a vision that reflected his own spiritual needs more than the lived realities of the Tahitian people. Yet, this deeply problematic aspect of his legacy possesses a profound and enduring relevance. The very questions his work raises are the questions that animate much of today's critical discourse in art and culture. His pursuit of an essential, unspoiled humanity, however flawed its methods, prefigures the ongoing debate about cultural appropriation, the search for authenticity in a globalized world, and the spiritual poverty of materialism. His personal solution, the flight to a self-constructed Eden, became a foundational problem for generations of thinkers and artists to unravel. He stands as a monumental case study in the power and the peril of the Western artist's gaze, a figure whose complex motivations force us to confront the ethical dimensions of aesthetic creation. The immediate inheritors of his legacy were the generation of artists who came of age at the turn of the 20th century. Each of the major modernist movements took a specific component of his revolution and amplified it into a new aesthetic system. The Fauves, led by Matisse, seized upon the liberation of color. In works like Matisse's *Flux, Clairement et volupté *, the sun-drenched landscape is rendered in a palette that answers to a logic of harmony and emotional intensity, a direct inheritance from Gauguin's symbolic color fields. The German expressionists of Die Bruch, like Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, found a different kind of permission in his work. They embraced the raw, psychological directness of his woodcuts, adopting the coarse gouges and angular forms to articulate the anxieties of the modern German city. The splendored, psychic energy of Kirchner's street scenes is the urban counterpart to the spiritual disquiet Gauguin found in his tropical paradise. Even the rigorous, analytical project of Cubism owes him a significant debt. Picasso embraced deconstruction of form into geometric planes built upon the structural liberties Gauguin had already taken. His flattening of pictorial space, his abandonment of linear perspective, and his treatment of figures as solid, almost sculptural masses provided a crucial stepping stone. Picasso's own famous encounter with Iberian and African sculpture, which proved so decisive for *less demi-cells dating on *, runs along a path first blazed by Gauguin's search for expressive power and forms outside the classical European tradition. Furthermore, the Surrealists, though charting the territories of the subconscious with psychoanalytic maps, recognized a spiritual ancestor. Andre Breton and his circle would have seen in a work like *, where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? *, a kindred attempt to pose life's great, unanswerable questions through an enigmatic, dreamlike visual language, a reality assembled from myth and private symbolism. In the final accounting, Gauguin emerges as the great disruptor, the theorist who weaponized aesthetics to achieve a philosophical aim. His legacy is etched less in any single style to be imitated and more in the radical expansion of what an artist was permitted to be. His paintings, sculptures, and prints were evidence in a larger argument for the supremacy of the inner vision. He bequeaths to the 20th century a new kind of artist, a figure who creates worlds, who legislates meaning, and whose ultimate justification is the force and integrity of their own subjectivity. The true masterpiece he crafted was the very idea of the modern artist, a conception so powerful and pervasive that it continues to define our understanding of creative endeavor. He provided the essential permission slip for modernism to happen, a legacy that resides in the very freedom of the artist to be the absolute authoritative source of the artwork's meaning.
We really appreciate you tuning in to this AI-powered presentation. Our goal is to push the boundaries of AI in content creation, and your input is invaluable. If there's a particular subject you'd like to see us tackle next, or if you have suggestions on how we could fine-tune our AI's creative prompts, please don't hesitate to leave your ideas in the comments section. We're excited to bring you more unique content very soon.